Hi, I'm Joe Scaife. I'm the Head of Audit here at Bishop Fleming. Today I'm going to be talking to my colleague Sally Timmins about the Academies benchmark report, and in particular, internal audit and risk management. Sally, welcome. Why is the profile of internal assurance so much stronger now?
That's a good question, Joe. It's interesting because it's always been really good practice to have strong internal assurance to allow the board to answer those questions of how do we know. But it's interesting that the handbook, of course, this year has made a highly increased focus on the audit committee, of the role that internal assurance plays, and of course the function guided much more directly within the handbook this year. But it is interesting because it's always been outstanding practice to actually make sure that you have a really good framework of provision as part of the wider assurance package for the board.
Okay, and so what are the risks that have come across this year in the benchmark report?
There are a few trends that have come through of common themes. They largely refer to mental health and well-being, of course, where there is a real concern about capacity and capability of staff to maintain the provision of education within trusts. It's not easy to make sure that the capacity there is full enough to allow the schools, of course, to remain open. Other risks are around having estates that have been closed for quite some time. Things like Legionella, which would normally fall, of course, within your health and safety checks under normal circumstances, but they just may not be at the forefront of minds of trusts where buildings have been closed for so long. Also things like catering provision, where services or other services may have actually been really challenged to be delivered because of difficulties with getting obviously contracts completed, etc. And where those contracts are pulled at short notice, it's really, really difficult for alternative provisions to be put in place really, really quickly. So risks along those lines.
Okay, and are we finding that trust boards are paying due care and attention to this then?
To internal assurance?
Yeah.
I think,
and risk registers as a whole?
Absolutely. A risk register is something that's very familiar to many people, and of course during COVID, risk assessments and opening and closing schools, and obviously containing that contamination and transmission of the virus, etc., has been really, really at the fore of leaders' minds, and making sure that's absolutely robust. But the wider risk assurance framework, perhaps not so much. So it's interesting that a real focus on risk management is being approached in many, many cases, quite rightly, to allow all of those risks to be collated in a single understandable format, to be able to be addressed, of course.
And what are the challenges going forward in the next year then, with what we've seen this year?
The challenges are really to be clear, for boards and leaders of trusts to be clear about what risks they are facing. There are two really important questions. Do I know the risks that my organisation is facing? And what are we doing to mitigate those risks? And of course, the risk management programme that trusts adopt really should make all of those pieces come together to answer those two questions. So internal assurance is one of those tools to help form that risk basis to answer those questions, so that the boards are in a position to actually know what they think is happening and what they think those control frameworks are really in place, and they are really being lived in the schools, rather than a policy that's stuck on a shelf that gathers dust.
So any trustees watching this should be able to answer those two key questions. Would you just like to repeat those two key questions again?
Absolutely. Do I know the risks that my organisation is facing, and what am I doing? What are we doing as a collective to mitigate those risks, and what framework are we going to put in place to allow us to be able to answer those questions? How do we know that those controls and frameworks are actually working?
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Sally. Please feel free to contact your usual advisor if there are any further questions coming from this.